next question today, Dr. Brian, this is going to be a question for you. And the question is this: what are the feasts of the Old Testament, and are they important to know for modern Christians?
Yeah, that's a great question. The feasts primarily come up in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, i.e. the books we skip over sometimes when we're reading the Old Testament. So we're aware they're there. They're not quite Tolkien's like elvish poems, things that like we go, okay, they're there and we'll just get past them. But the feasts of the Old Testament are important. And so Tim, when this question came in, I thought it was a good question. And I went, hey, I teach like a 2-hour class on the feasts, but let me try to break it down into like a 5 to 10 minute answer for us. I wanted to start with a quote. And so I'm going to look down here to read. And this is from John Swain when he talks about feasts and festivals. He said, feasts are regularly occurring community events that recognize God's work and presence with his people. And that's going to be important. We'll talk about kind of all these different feasts that are celebrated in the Old Testament, but that's their goal, right? A chance to recognize God's work and presence with his people. I loved how Swain put it, so I wanted to share that quote with you all. Now, the feasts are described in numerous places in the Old Testament, but some of the big chapters for us might be Leviticus 16 and 23, Numbers 28, 29, and Deuteronomy 16. Clearly, they're also in other places, but these are some of our kind of big tentpole passages, as it were. Now, when we look at the feasts, 3 are going to be ones that require you to journey to Jerusalem, right? We'll call these pilgrimage feasts. And then we also have some additional ones that did not require you as an ancient Israelite to travel to Jerusalem. So let's start with the pilgrimage feasts. The first one, and this should be not a surprise to any of us, is Passover. These tend to be the ones we know, right? So Passover is the celebration of God's deliverance of the people in the book of Exodus as he passed over their houses. By passing over, right, God allows the firstborn of Israel to live. He takes the firstborn of Egypt. So this was a feast that was celebrated by traveling to Jerusalem. And during it, a second feast took place. So not technically a pilgrimage feast, but because you were almost always in Jerusalem, you celebrated it there. And that's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So this was a week-long remembrance with the consecrated of the coming season. It's an extension kind of the Passover. So although it is labeled separately, it's connected to it. So you have the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You also have, as a second pilgrimage feast, the Feast of Weeks. Now, average Christian, that might not mean anything, but if I gave you its Greek name, you'd absolutely recognize it. The Feast of Weeks is known in Greek as Pentecost. And so this might be a surprise, right, Tim, to some of our listeners, that Pentecost is actually an Old Testament feast. So a little blurb on it. It's named for the 7 weeks separating it from the Passover celebration. So Pentecost in Greek means 50 days. 7 weeks is 49 days. We'll just round it to make it easy and call it 50. So we call it Pentecost, right? It's a celebration of the entrance into the promised land and all the riches therein. We'll come back to the significance of these feasts for understanding the New Testament, but can you already see some of the beauty of what Pentecost in the book of Acts celebrates? This coming into the promised land and celebrating the gifts of God as his people are now where they are supposed to be. So real quick to finish the pilgrimage feasts, we have Passover, we have Pentecost, and then we have the Feast of Tabernacles. And so this is a commemoration of the wilderness wanderings. It was sometimes called the Feast of Ingathering because this is when people come together at the harvest time, and it's the final feast of the Israelite calendar year. Now, outside of those, there are 2 other feasts that did not require a pilgrimage, but are still significant. The first is the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah. This is going to be the New Year celebration. This is the beginning of the new agricultural year, not necessarily a calendar year as we're used to it in the modern world. And then secondly, you have the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. This is the most holy of all their feasts. It's not Hanukkah. I mean, I think most people probably know that, but Yom Kippur is the high holiday of the Jewish faith tradition, right? This is the one time of year where the high priest could enter into the Holy of Holies and make atonement for his people. So those are the 2 other kind of significant Old Testament feasts. Now, interestingly, because the Old Testament ends right in the 4th century BC. You still have some development within that faith. And so you might have noticed I didn't mention Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a post-Old Testament development, as is another famous holiday, Purim. Now, Tim, we know that this comes actually from a story in the Old Testament, even if the feast isn't initiated. It comes from the story of Esther and the celebration of the deliverance of God's people. So you'd have this beautiful celebration, not really a sacrifice, but a celebration of being alive, of God's deliverance. It's not quite Jewish Mardi Gras, but it can get kind of rowdy. It is a celebration of life and all the fullness therein. You then also do have Hanukkah. So Hanukkah, this is another reason why you should read the intertestamental or Second Temple writings that are kept for us in the Catholic canon, the Deuterocanon of the Old Testament, because this is something that comes out of the book of Maccabees and the revolts that he led against Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the rededication of the temple after it was profaned, and it comes from a legend wherein there was only enough oil for 1 day, but it kept on going, and the light remained lit for 8 days. And so that's what Hanukkah is, even though it happens near Christmas, has nothing to do with that type of season, and it's not anywhere near as significant as Christmas is for the Christian tradition. There are other holidays, if you want to look throughout all of Jewish history. One of the fun ones I put in, Tim, just for us, is Yom Nicanor. Apologize for that. That's the day before Purim. It was a celebration of the defeat of the Syrian general Nicanor by the Maccabeans, but it's not typically celebrated anymore. It's just rolled in together with Purim. Now, so that was part one of the question. What are the feasts? There you go, listeners. Probably too much information, but sorry. There you go. Now, why does it matter? Well, I think there's at least 3 reasons for us as Christians to at least be aware of these feasts. First, I think they prefigure Jesus's ministry and work. The Day of Atonement. I don't think you can understand the cross. I don't think you can understand, right, what is happening through that final week of Jesus's life. I don't think we understand the book of Hebrews and the argument it is making about this high priest if you don't understand the Day of Atonement and what that signified, what that did for the people of Israel. And Christ taking on that sacrifice, becoming both high priest and sacrifice for his people, right? There's a lot of beautiful theology. There's a lot of beautiful prefiguring, I think, in this feast that we should understand. So that's the first reason. Second reason is because I think it helps us prefigure and see the value and beauty of the church. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's an accident that the church begins at Pentecost, a celebration of coming into the promised land. What stronger symbol of what the church is now supposed to be? This beautiful entrance into the kingdom of God, the kingdom that is already but not yet. We have entered into the metaphorical promised land of God's blessings, right? Right there in Jerusalem, then to Samaria, then to the ends of the earth. So I think we will appreciate more Acts and what is going on through that book if we understand the Feast of Pentecost at the very least. And then lastly, I think it just helps us understand the culture and values of the world. It is very important to understand what a society ritualizes in a festival, in a feast, in a ritual, because that reveals at a deep level, beyond what they just say is important, what they truly treasure and value. These feasts were designed to force your average Israelite, right, who didn't necessarily read the Tanakh on a day-to-day basis, didn't necessarily have that option, but it forced them to, in their day-to-day practice and how they organized and set up their lives, to focus on God, his provision and work in their history, and what he is continually calling them to do going forward. So I strongly recommend go in, dig into the Old Testament, dig into the feasts especially, because I think they will help you understand both the New Testament and the Old. So that's my very long, short answer. Sorry about that. Tim, anything I missed or anything you want to correct real quick?
No, nothing you missed or anything to correct, but something just to add as we think about those feasts. They were meant to be formative. And Brian, that's what you're saying in the sense that the Israelites who went through them they were formed by them in terms of having their memory stoked and their lives truly being based around in their calendars and the way they sowed and reaped. It was all based around these feasts and what they represented. And I agree wholeheartedly with what you said in your last point, Brian, that as we think about our lives, we might not recognize, but our lives are really formed in a similar way by what we do, not just by what we say we believe. And for listeners who might be in a more liturgical tradition that has a little bit of formality or follows the church calendar, for some evangelicals, they might look at that and say, well, that's just ritual. It doesn't matter. But the reality is the feasts that we even celebrate today, we base our lives around them, whether it's, a secular holiday or whether it's the 4th of July or whether it's Thanksgiving or whatever. We tend to shape our calendar and shape our life around those things. Same thing true for the Israelite people, except they were intentionally seeking to shape their lives around the works of God in their history. And so it was more than just time to celebrate. It was a time to be formed as a worshiper of Yahweh. And to that degree, I think we can wholeheartedly say, yes, we should learn from that example. And even if we don't celebrate the feast, I don't think there's a New Testament obligation to celebrate those feasts, but we should certainly understand how Christ fulfills all of the feasts. And ultimately, we look forward to a feast, right? The marriage supper of the Lamb, as we think about feasting together in the new heavens and the new earth. So great information, Brian. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And for our listeners, if you want to kind of get into the mindset of how did these form kind of the culture of the Israelites, I want you to think of how we do it in our modern culture. If you go into Target, if you go into your local grocery store, there's always a section about the next coming holiday, right?
Yes.
So right now, you've got stuff for Halloween, then it's going to be Thanksgiving, then it's going to be Christmas, and on and on and on, right? It's always going, here's the next major signpost. The feasts did the same thing for the ancient Israelites, but instead of going, here's the next thing to spend money on or to, give candy to kids on, here's the next element in our nation's history with God that we should be focused on. Here's the beginning of the harvest as we go out, and begin sowing our fields. Here's the end of the harvest where we gather back in. At each step, it was supposed to focus not on just another, yay, we get a day off from work, but wow, this is a God who has walked with us. So next time you're in your grocery store and you go, I can't believe they have those things out so early, recognize that what it's doing is trying to build the anticipation and focus on that holiday. That's what the feasts did for the ancient Israelite in their day-to-day lives.